So this is Queer Libertarianism panel, and I'm just going to introduce the two panelists and let them do their thing. So Kelly Wright is a local DC trans activist working to spread awareness of the plight of trans people with particular emphasis on harm both by the state. Kelly is also a former Students for Liberty campus coordinator and group president from Ohio. And then the second panelist is Nathan Goodman. Nathan is a second-year PhD student in the Department of Economics at George Mason University. He earned his BS in mathematics from the University of Utah. Nathan has worked as a research fellow for the Center for Statewide Society, a program intern for the Law and Economics Center at George Mason, and a summer fellow at the Fully Informed Jury Association. His research interests include Austrian economics, public choice economics, self-governance, and institutional analysis of security and policing. So without further ado, Kelly.
Everyone hear me? Yes?
Yep.
So the way this is going to work is I'm going to speak for about 15 minutes. Nathan is going to speak for about 15 minutes, and then we're going to leave a sizable chunk of time for questions, because I imagine there will be a lot. I'm going to go over a very queer, LGBT, trans-centric perspective on social justice and libertarianism, and then Nathan's going to kind of take that and then expand on it to encompass a little bit more. So without further ado, what do we mean by queering? Basically what we're going to do is we're going to try to illustrate how the state incentivizes and in some cases coerces like compulsory monogamy, cisnormativity, and heteronormativity. And what I mean by those words are kind of like prioritizing or preferencing genders that are congruent with the typical sex binary that we live in. And then, of course, compulsory monogamy in the state heavily incentivizes and in fact prohibits marriages to multiple partners. And then heteronormativity is similar to cisnormativity. It's preferencing the sexual orientation of heterosexual people. So I have like two laptops to keep moving, so I have my notes, so please bear with me. Libertarianism, this is something that I think the audience is probably a little bit more familiar with. Libertarianism prioritizes individual rights and autonomy over nearly everything. Libertarians can also prioritize more utilitarian ends, such as the elimination of poverty or like the elimination of war, militarism. Though they'll say that liberty is the alternative that we want to go for. Liberty is the way we get rid of poverty, etc. So, in an ideal libertarian society, we would have a society of autonomous individuals voluntarily and freely associating with one another toward mutually advantageous and self-determined ends. I would add that there's a particular emphasis on opposition to coercion or the initiation of force. This is the non-aggression principle, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. And so what I'm going to try to do is I am going to combine the two so that we can have an analysis of the struggle for queer liberation and the role of the state in the subjugation of queer individuals. I will show the history of the LGBT movement, and I will show how it's an intimate portrait of resistance to state violence. I will provide a trans perspective on libertarianism and a libertarian perspective on being trans. So first we'll do history. There seems to be a general belief that Tumblr is why there are more than two genders now, and that's not really the case. Trans people have always existed. I pulled up this picture. This is actually something I just learned about recently. Basically, this statue right here is a figurine. This is about 30 centimeters high. This is from the early Roman Empire. And this is actually a statue of Aphrodite, which is basically an iteration of Aphrodite, though with male genitalia. And what's kind of cool, this is a caption I pulled from Wikipedia. The statue stood 30 centimeters high. It was represented in a style known as, I never say this right, a nastromenos, which is a female lifting her dress to reveal male genitals, a gesture that was believed to have apotropaic qualities over evil influences and bestowing good luck, which I think is really cool. More contemporary history. I want to talk about the origins of the contemporary movement for LGBTQ rights. And that started in 1969 at the Stonewall riots. which not a lot of people know, even like people in the LGBT community, they don't know that it was actually a riot against police and police violence. So the Stonewall Inn was a hotel that is still in New York City, and it was a haven, it was a meeting spot for gay people. And they would go there. It's actually kind of an interesting history. The staff of Stonewall actually paid off the mafia, so that and then the mafia kept the police away. But after a while, the police they had such animosity toward queer people that they didn't really care, and they continuously raided Stonewall and other venues, I guess. And at one point in 1969, June of 1969, people were kind of sick and tired of it, and we had the Stonewall riots, which was initially started by two trans women of color, in particular Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera. They're two crucial people in the origins of the LGBTQ rights movement. A couple other examples are Cooper's Donuts in 1959. That was a decade before Stonewall. And that was, Cooper's Donuts is another similar situation where laws actually prohibited, like, quote, cross-dressing, but Cooper's Donuts basically let people in anyway and be like drag queens, etc. And the police didn't have a lot of tolerance for that, and they came and arrested a bunch of people. Another one is Black Cat in LA, that was just before Stonewall. Following from Stonewall, we have finally a movement for gay rights. If you think about the time period, 1969, this was like the end of the 60s, the end of the civil rights era. It was the beginning of the sexual revolution that took place in the 70s. And you finally have a contingent of people who are actually agitating for like rights, for respect for queer people, especially in the form of like stop imprisoning us, stop beating us, that sort of thing. Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera founded the Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, also in the Star. I think later, I don't know how much later, but later that was changed to Street Transgender Action Revolutionaries. And that was the first youth shelter for LGBTQ people in North America. And this is Marsha right here, and that's Sylvia. And they actually supported Star through sex work. All the money they paid rent for a building to house homeless queer youth, and they did all this through sex work, which was pretty crazy given the time period. Moving on, marriage. I think we all know that access to the institution of marriage is a hotly debated and controlled topic. It's heavily controlled by the state. Until recently, only one man and one woman could enter into a marriage. The Supreme Court recently determined that that was unconstitutional. Denying same-sex couples with marriage licenses is unconstitutional. Obviously, there's also major societal and cultural pressure to get married and to reproduce. By queering marriage, we're basically going to challenge, we're going to challenge heteronormativity. Sorry, my timer. We're basically challenging marriage as an institution only for heterosexual couples or just couples. Like it could be, I believe there's a libertarian argument to be made that a marriage could consist of more than two people. A good text on this, I just really want to put Walter and Declare. They Who Marry Do Ill. It's an anarchist feminist take on monogamy in marriage and the involvement of the government in marriage. Moving on, how do we queer sex and gender? The state assigns and tracks an individual's sex or gender throughout life. This is where we get the terms assigned male at birth or assigned female at birth. I prefer this language to like born a boy or born a girl, because it makes a lot more intuitive sense, and it's also more accurate to say that when someone was born, they are assigned male or they are assigned female. And then that determination as made at birth goes on virtually every government document from birth to death. Relevant contemporary examples of the state kind of swinging back in the direction of oppressing trans people is this growing trend of states attempting to define what sex is or what gender is, which I think is problematic. And they do so in a way that preferences the genders and sexualities of cisgender heterosexual people at the disadvantage of transgender homosexual people. We should, this is really important, we should oppose state attempts to define gender or sex the same way we oppose state attempts to define marriage. A lot of states, I think even Virginia where I live, they're trying to put it into the state constitution that sex is the genetic, is your genetics at birth, which is just kind of awkward. Another part about sex assigned at birth is that it imposes costs on trans people who wish to update their identity documents. And it basically ensures that poor people can't, and that only people with access to money and access to the process, to going to court, paying the fees, going before a judge, all this ridiculous stuff that trans people have to jump through in order to change their name or their gender marker. And so this informs some other things I'm going to talk about, which is, I'm going to go through a couple examples of how the state kind of creates a stigma of LGBTQ people. One example from the 60s is the three-piece rule, where it was actually a crime for women to wear masculine clothing. The three-piece rule referred to kind of like a policy by which if they arrested a woman who was wearing too masculine clothing, they would do a quick count, and if they were wearing at least 3 articles of, quote, traditionally feminine clothing, they could be let go. If they weren't, then they could be arrested. Trans immigrants are far more likely to be confronted, arrested, or even deported by the state. And when they are done so, they are usually housed in prisons and detention centers of the sex that they were assigned at birth. So if you can imagine a trans woman being forced into a detention center with other men, it could create some issues. In fact, LGBTQ people in prisons are far more likely to be victims of sexual assault, prison rape, that sort of thing. Actually, I have a note about this woman I wanted to stay. The TSA is a really big example of how the state just doesn't really conceive of or comprehend the existence of non-cis bodies, of bodies that deviate from the sex binary. And so this is actually really fascinating. When you go to the airport and you go before the machine that takes a picture of your naked body, there's 2 buttons that the TSA agent can push, which is like blue and pink, blue for boy, pink for girl. And if they'll deduce from looking at you what your gender is, they'll push a button and you walk in, and if your body deviates from that preconceived notion, then you'll be pulled aside for additional molestation. Another thing is, I just wanted to say another example, was until recently, Philadelphia actually had sex markers on their Metro cards, which seems really egregious and unnecessary, and a trans woman actually took the city of Philadelphia and their Metro court, and the court ruled that that was actually a violation of privacy. Keep putting a sex marker on a Metro pass is a violation of the individual's privacy. Just a little bit more. New York City, there was that controversial Stop and Frisk program, disproportionately affected trans people. Of those who responded to a survey, 28% of straight cisgender people were stopped, whereas 51% of LGBTQ respondents were stopped, 59% of trans, which is kind of crazy. AIDS is another really big issue. The AIDS epidemic in the 80s was exacerbated because the government honestly couldn't care less about who was afflicted. The FDA in particular took something like 7 years to approve the first life-saving treatment for HIV or AIDS, and a lot of people died. This is actually a picture of an AIDS activist in the 70s. If I died of AIDS, just throw my body at the steps of the FDA. There's also kind of a good movie, Dallas Buyers Club. You guys have heard of it, but what's his name? Matthew McConaughey basically creates an underground black market for AIDS drugs, and there's a lot of connections, like the right to try. People have a right to try to save their life, even if the state thinks that they shouldn't. Okay, I'm running a little bit out of time, so I'm going to speed up. I just did this next slide in Lawrence v. Texas. This is a Supreme Court case from 2003. It's a landmark Supreme Court case that struck down Texas and 13 other states' anti-sodomy laws, and it actually legalized same-sex sexual activity in the entirety of the United States. Pretty crazy situation here. It established a right to privacy inside the home, protected by the 14th Amendment, especially conduct engaged in by consenting adults. And so my last slide before I hand it up to Nathan is a potential queer libertarian public policy agenda. The first one would be completely legalized sex work. I think that's just like a no-brainer, honestly. One that might be a little bit more radical is to remove sex and gender markers from government IDs. This would allow people to kind of self-determine instead of having something assigned to them. I think this would also go a long way to kind of eliminating the inequality faced by trans individuals who have to go through an expensive process, an expensive and bureaucratic process of updating identity documents. Libertarians could also oppose corrective cosmetic surgeries for people who are born with ambiguous genitalia, what intersex means. Generally, about the statistics I heard is that about 1 in 8 people are born with ambiguous genitalia, which is about the same amount of people who are born with red hair. And it's less of the case today, but a lot in the past, doctors would correct their genitalia without even consulting the parents, let alone the infant, the new human. And so I think the libertarian position here is to wait for the individual to be old enough to consent to something like that. And then lastly, I would like to see the abolishment of the TSA, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and the FDA. I think those are already libertarian positions, radical libertarian positions, but I think we can just, when we're talking to maybe a social justice crowd or a queer crowd, we can say, hey, look, this is something that affects the queer community, and this is a way that libertarianism can help. Finally, respect for and defend the rights of everyone, not just trans or queer people, to self-determine and express their gender or sexuality. And I think if you want to be a consistent advocate of freedom of expression, you should include a defense of those individuals. I think I'm at exactly 15 minutes, a little bit over. So Nathan's going to talk for 15 minutes and then we'll do Q&A.
Thank you very much, Kelly. So, what are we doing here talking at a libertarian conference about social justice? Didn't the great Friedrich Hayek show that was all bunk? Hayek's a very important economist, one of the greatest classical liberals of all time. He wrote an excellent book called Law, Legislation, and Liberty, The Mirage of Social Justice. This is volume 2 of his series of books on law, legislation, and liberty. Now, I think what we need to understand about Hayek's argument against social justice is that Hayek is using a particular definition. And what he's arguing is that concerns about justice of distribution, particularly the distribution of wealth in a society, rest on what he considers a category mistake. He says that social justice is akin to the concept of a moral stone. His argument is that by arguing that particular distributions of wealth are just or unjust, we're making a mistake, because justice can be seen in actions or in rules, but not in spontaneous orders. A spontaneous order that arises from the interactions of individuals, provided those individuals have acted justly, the result of that process cannot be considered unjust. This is correct, I think, as far as it goes. It's a reasonable response to concerns about distributive justice. And it should be something that we engage when we're in more academic debates with our interlocutors who disagree with us. But we should keep in mind that Hayek also said in this very book that he agreed with John Rawls, the political philosopher whose book, A Theory of Justice, can be understood as a theory of social justice. Hayek makes an argument that's very similar to Rawls's notion of the veil of ignorance. The veil of ignorance being when you're evaluating the justice of a society, you ask whether you would accept its institutional arrangements if you didn't know what social position you were going to be placed in. Whether you would be poor or rich, whether you would be trans or cis, whether you would be white or black. Hayek uses an example very similar to this, and what Rawls deduces from this is that we should ask whether we should evaluate institutions on the basis of how they do for the welfare of the least well-off. Hayek makes a similar argument, but I'm not sure he gets to that same principle regarding social justice. His concern is more, do institutions promote coordination? But the degree to which classical liberal thinkers like Hayek and also James M. Buchanan, the founder of public choice theory, agreed with John Rawls, suggests that Rawlsian conceptions of social justice may be compatible with classical liberal thought to a degree that the distributive justice conceptions that Hayek rightly critiqued are not. Moreover, many people on the left use social justice in a far broader way, they're treating concern about racism or concern about sexism as inherently a social justice concern. So we should be mindful that when we say social justice is a category mistake, we may miscommunicate. We may get people to think, oh, these people don't care about racism, they don't care about sexism, they don't care about homophobia. When in fact we do. We care quite deeply, or at least I care quite deeply, about the well-being of the least well-off and of those who have been marginalized in our society. And so we should perhaps accept Hayek's arguments. We should be clear about the importance of spontaneous order in society. We should be clear that wealth is not distributed by some giver of wealth, but in fact emerges through the market process. But we should not make the mistake of alienating potential allies through imprecise definitions of social justice and demonizing people when we may not be sure why they're using the words they've chosen. Now, what about trigger warnings? Many people, particularly in libertarian circles, act as though trigger warnings are inherently a violation of free speech. I don't think so. I think that trigger warnings are, in many instances, an act of speech. If I put a note at the top of an article I write and say, hey, I'm going to have graphic depictions of rape and sexual assault in this article, that's me offering a potentially fair warning to readers so they can make an informed decision about whether or not they want to read my article. Content warnings already exist in a variety of forms. If I say, hey, this content's not safe for work, spoiler alert, I'm going to tell you how Game of Thrones ends. If I say that this film has a given rating so that you know whether you think that content's going to be appropriate, provided none of these are made mandatory, these are all various ways of speaking so that our audiences can be more aware of what content we're about to see. If you want a sort of good empirical understanding of what the actual state of trigger warnings is on college campuses, the National Coalition Against Censorship did a poll of a variety of professors. They surveyed them to figure out whether very many had faced mandatory trigger warnings or had been asked by their students to provide trigger warnings. It was only a small minority that were even asked, and an even smaller minority that faced any institutional or administrative pressure. So it's something that potentially we should watch out for, but we shouldn't dismiss people simply because they give a trigger warning. That in itself is merely an act of speech and a way of communicating and potentially being courteous to people who have experienced trauma and who might not want to be exposed to certain graphic imagery or depictions of things related to their own trauma. What about safe spaces? Aren't those an assault on freedom of speech? Well, maybe, but not necessarily. Safe spaces can be an instance of free association. For example, when I was growing up in Utah as a young bisexual kid, the Utah Pride Center was a nonprofit, a community center that engaged in acts of free association, organized a space, and in that space there were certain social norms that might have been different in some of the more hegemonically Mormon communities of Utah. So kids who were perhaps kicked out of their homes for being queer or trans would often go to youth groups at the Utah Pride Center. And this was a safe space for them, where it would not have been a safe space for them to be out about their identity in their local church, their local ward, their home. This is simply free association and civil society establishing spaces in which people can authentically be themselves. Clubs, churches, academic departments, all of these institutions interact within society. Within a broader society, there needs to be a strong norm of free expression so that all these diverse groups can coexist. But within any one of these groups, some norms are going to emerge and some things might be off the table. You might not be allowed to go into the Utah Pride Center and start shouting homophobic slurs. You might not be able to go walk into a church and say Hail Satan without being asked to leave. You might not be able to walk into the economics department and instead of having a debate about price theory, say, isn't this all neoliberal horse shit, Professor? Now, for more on this and the role of safe spaces within a diverse society, safe spaces as part of a classically liberal order, I highly recommend a blog post by Jacob T. Levy on safe spaces, academic freedom, and the university as a complex association, which is published at the blog Bleeding Heart Libertarians. Now, one thing that I think libertarians should be concerned about, and one thing where I think we can offer a lot of analytical insights to the left, is the crucial issue of police militarization. These are two books, both by excellent libertarians, who have criticized police militarization. Radley Balco is a libertarian journalist who used to work for Reason Magazine, before that worked at the Cato Institute. He's sort of the key journalistic opponent of police militarization. And this book, Tyranny Comes Home, has either just come out or is coming out very soon. It's by two excellent economists, George Mason University professor of economics Christopher J. Coyne, and his former graduate student Abigail R. Hall, who now teaches in Florida. Both of them are excellent economists who elucidate the economic mechanisms by which foreign interventions abroad lead to grotesque violations of civil liberties at home. When we train people to engage in violence, torture, and occupation abroad, those people come home. They bring their weapons. They bring the skill sets they learned through military occupations, and those skill sets become applied by local police departments. SWAT teams were created by veterans of wars abroad, veterans of the Korean War and the Vietnam War. By creating SWAT teams, they created teams that bust into people's homes, largely for nonviolent drug offenses, often killing innocent people. The federal government gives countless military weapons to local police departments, moving their attention from serving local communities to serving the interests of their federal financiers. The result? Death, violence, and destruction, and death, violence, and destruction that falls disproportionately on marginalized people. As Hall and Coyne explained in one of their many academic articles on the subject, one published in the Journal of Peace Research, members of minority groups are those who are most likely to be victimized and brutalized by police militarization because their ability to exercise both voice and exit, which are the two ways that you can strain an organization, either by voicing your concerns or by moving, by saying, this town sucks, I'm leaving. Both of those are constrained when you are poorer and when you have been marginalized within a society. What about those who try to use social justice as an excuse, as a cover for police militarization? Austin Mayor Steve Adler, after Donald Trump banned trans people from serving in the armed forces, said, oh, all of you have been kicked out of the armed forces, you should join our police department. And he got accolades from progressives. I think that the ban on trans people in the military was an affront to equal protection under the law. It's something that we as classical liberals should be deeply concerned about. But rather than seeking inclusion within apparatuses of state violence and state control, we should be concerned about the existence of those apparatuses and how those institutions operate. When people who have served in foreign wars bring their skills home to police the streets of the United States, they are bringing home skills that are honed for violent social control in war zones. Inviting veterans to be hired in your local police department is a channel by which human capital that is specialized for violent repression and war can bring war to our streets. And it doesn't become good simply because it is wrapped in a rainbow flag. We could have two different visions of what a transgender hero looks like. Indeed, we can have many visions. There are as many virtues and as many conceptions of the good as there are human beings. But two visions of trans heroism that have prevailed and been on the national stage in public debates revolve around whistleblower and former political prisoner Chelsea Manning and Kristen Beck, former member of U.S. Navy SEAL Team 6, which famously assassinated Osama bin Laden. Chelsea Manning exposed war crimes. She leaked a litany of cables to Wikileaks.
What is the hazard in the past 10 years? The left disappeared completely on the anti-war issue, which, let's be honest, was the cheap military issue. They're still gone. Trump's in office, suddenly it's a problem. But it's not the war issue, it's he says mean things or says he hates immigrants or whatever. It's too different than it was for Obama. Libertarians never invited on these networks. There's no groups really calling for us to join them. What makes you think that we really can't buy allies there? I mean, I've had more success getting my right-wing Christian conservative friends to maybe think marijuana is probably okay, and you know, we should let the gays do what they want to do, that sort of thing. Like, I'm not against what you think about that.
I think that's a really valid concern. I think that there were people who stayed strong on the war issue under Obama, but they were far too few and far too far between. We should be reaching out to people like Glenn Greenwald, who have been willing to work with the Cato Institute and the Future of Freedom Foundation to oppose the warfare state and civil liberties violations. A lot of our allies are going to be on the radical left rather than the centrist democratic left, because the centrist democratic left doesn't have an institutional critique of the state. They simply want their team to be in power. The ACLU also has generally been fairly friendly to working with libertarians. But it's a tough sell, unfortunately, including to the radical left, because the radical left, unfortunately, radically disagrees with us on the core question of are markets and private property rights a good thing? We think they are, and they don't. And that's an issue where we need to be willing to have fundamental conversations across different political ideologies and say, look, as Don Lavoie, the great economist who died far too young and was a professor at George Mason University for quite a few years, said, planning is the militarization of the economy. If you are truly concerned about the warfare state, you should oppose central planning, because central planning moves things from bottom-up grassroots social cooperation to the control of the central state, and that is fundamentally the militarist state. But that's a hard sell, and I think it's understandable to think that it's a losing battle, but I hope at least some of us will be fighting.
I just wanted to add, I think you're right to a certain extent. I think I would love to do a version of this PowerPoint where instead of kind of bringing a queer perspective to libertarians and taking a libertarian perspective to like the queer community, it's actually something that I spend a lot of time doing in my free time, is trying to convince my like LGBTQ plus friends that libertarians are actually allies. Any other questions?
So, Nathan, it's nice to see you again, and your idea is always riveting and always fresh, so it's good to see another presentation from you. My question is to continue on from the colleague. So if we do create a coalition between the social justice movements and within ourselves, what sort of resources and pieces of intelligence do the libertarians have that we can get out to them? What sort of power, so to speak, do we have?
I think we have better analysis. I think that when I was working with leftists in Utah, for example, they organized a lecture where they brought Radley Balfour to speak. So a lot of the comparative advantage of libertarians has been analysis. A lot of the comparative advantage of leftists has been grassroots direct action and protest. And so we get our ideas into the hands of the people who are working on the ground, and that can be a really powerful recipe.
You kind of touched on my question earlier, but like a lot of people, like a lot of my like friends that are gay, also they make fun of me a lot of times for being libertarian, and they just tell me like, why did you vote for Hillary? Why did you do all this stuff? How do you personally bring libertarianism to the queer community that's kind of hostile because, and it's kind of weird that they're hostile because the Democratic Party like turned on them for a while and then like came back to them, but libertarianism kind of always been on their side.
I feel like I see a slide. I had a slide in here about how the Libertarian Party was the first political party to endorse same-sex marriage, and they did so all the way back in 1976, I think. That's a big deal. Hillary Clinton didn't come around officially to supporting same-sex marriage until like 2013, I think. So yeah, I try to explain to my fellow queers, I guess, that Democrats are progressives, as Nathan said, are very much not really, they don't really care so much about us, they care about getting power, and they kind of like speak to us or kind of throw us a bone every once in a while to kind of get us to the polls, maybe vote for them. I've never voted for a Democrat in my life, and I never will. So yeah, I guess I would just kind of say like, look, libertarians have kind of been way ahead of this issue than either Democrats or Republicans, and I think we can continue to do so. That's another reason why I wanted to bring up that Libertarian Party thing, is that libertarians in the past were great on this issue, on LGBT rights. They were there. And for some reason, they've kind of swung the other way. I wanted to speak something that you said, which is, I think you pointed over here, you said this, building a coalition with the social justice crowd. I think a big problem, and it kind of touches on both of your questions, is that there seems to be this conflation of the queer community and with social justice, or that everyone who identifies on this like rainbow spectrum, whatever, are leftists or Democrats or on the left side of things. I don't think that's necessarily the case. I don't think it has to be. So, like one thing, a word that really makes my skin crawl is when people say transgenderism, as if it's like an ideology upon itself. I recoil when I see that, because all the queer community is saying is like, literally stop beating us, stop putting us in jail, stop deporting us, stop all this stuff. I'm sure there's a good chunk who are like, give us, handouts or whatever. That's not the position that I'm coming from.
Felicia?
What is your, or this is either of you or both of you, what is your response to whether it's conservatives or more socially conservative libertarians who feel that that the LGBTQ movement has become less of a this is about rights, but then about privilege, it's just more of a what is your response to conservatives that feel that way?
So, with respect to privilege, what at least in the context of like libertarianism and like queer rights within libertarianism, the privileges that I'm assaulting or calling into question are the privileges that are afforded by the state, which is if you're in a heterosexual monogamous marriage, you have access to tons of benefits like power of attorney, medical benefits, visitation rights, all kinds of stuff. And so there is a lot of privilege that comes with being a member of the social justice terms like the cishet patriarchy or something like that. But if you're a cisgender heterosexual white man, because of that class that you occupy, the state affords you so much, whether it's blatant or more subconscious. And so what I try to do when I'm speaking with more social conservative types is look, the state obviously preferences certain identities or certain classes, obviously. And I don't think that makes us less libertarian to point that out. And so that's kind of what I'd say.
I think part of what you might be raising with your concern is that rather than seeking rights, LGBT activists might be seeking privileges for ourselves, special privileges from the state. Is that more what you're asking? So it seems like things like anti-discrimination laws, which would compel association rather than simply getting rid of barriers to our own advancement in the free market, these sorts of things, or subsidies for people. I think that as libertarians, we should be critical of those things where they arise, and we should be the one voice that's giving a critique of, for example, anti-discrimination laws that's grounded not in the idea that it is good or an important thing because of one's religion to be able to discriminate, but instead that just free association is part of a free society, and that free association is what we're seeking for our rights to engage in whatever forms of consensual relationships we want, and we want to extend that including to those who might be opposed to us.
So we're actually at time, but it's lunch, so it's exciting. And our table, we're actually right out here.